Before we start this video, I just want to give a quick disclaimer. All of my opinions featured here are based on Scholar of the First Sin Edition, and plus, this is all my own personal opinion, which, shockingly, might not match your own. But anyway, on with the video. Well, as you can probably tell, I love Dark Souls, and last video, I ranked all of the areas in Dark Souls 1 from the worst to the best in my opinion, and so far, the reception on that video has been very positive, which I cannot express how happy I am about. So, today I'm going to be ranking all of the areas in Dark Souls 2 from the worst to the best. Just like the last video, there will of course be some minor areas excluded, and in addition to this, I will be commenting on any boss runbacks that warrant it, because as much as I love Dark Souls 2, and do admittedly think that it's a better game than Dark Souls 1, this game has some horrific boss runbacks, so I'll only be going over the ones that I think are worth mentioning. But anyway, it's time to talk about the area that got number 30 on this list. The absolute lowest spot, and the dishonorable crown of being the absolute worst area not just in Dark Souls 2, but in the entire Souls series. You probably already know what area this is, but either way, everyone give a big, fat, warm welcome to the Frigid Outskirts. Now, firstly, let's start off with the area's level design, or rather, its complete and total lack of it. It is literally just one gigantic, wide open field with practically nothing inside it. That's all it is. It looks extremely dull, there's nothing special about it at all, and it's pretty much just a beeline straight to the boss at the end once you actually know where to go. But the complete lack of any level design or interesting visuals is far from the biggest issue with this area, because as a matter of fact, on the way to the boss, you'll be assaulted by a blinding snowstorm which can very easily disorient you and cause you to make a wrong turn, which could end up with you getting lost and having to waste even more time in this godforsaken place. But even still, they managed to make this area even worse, because all the way through the area, whether there's a snowstorm or not, you'll be constantly ambushed by a bunch of reindeer who are specifically designed to stop you from outrunning them. Not only are the reindeer designed to stop you from outrunning them completely, but they are also just awful to try and fight. It's ridiculously hard to successfully dodge their attacks, and they'll always spam a charge attack, which I genuinely think is impossible to avoid until you either kill them or they kill you. And if you die at all, you don't get a shortcut or a bonfire. You've just gotta start over from scratch right at the start and spend a good few minutes running all the way back. And as for the boss, I don't have any footage of Ludden-Zolan, and trust me, there is no way in hell I'm running all the way back through this bullshit boss run back just to get footage of them. This boss is absolutely terrible. Normally, when I'm talking about something in one of these games, I try to find at least something positive I can say. But there is genuinely nothing good about the Frigid Outskirts. Seriously, what sadistic developer thought it would be a good idea to put in this dull-looking, uncreative, unimaginative, mechanically awful abomination? I hate everything about this area. But anyway, now that we've got that absolute atrocity out of the way, let's talk about areas that are still awful in their own right, but not as much as this area. Coming in at number 29, we have the Iron Passage. This area has two linear paths you can choose to take, the first of which is meant to be the normal route, and literally all it is just 3 linear hallways, one after the other, all 3 of which with a bunch of enemies spammed everywhere inside of them. Some of them are your regular melee enemies, some of them are archers, and then there are some that are sorcerers who cast a spell that slows down your rolling. Seriously, why did those sorcerers have to get put in here? It's completely unnecessary. If you just try to fight off every enemy one by one, it's a complete and total disaster. So really, your best bet is to just try your luck by sprinting through this part of the area. And if you do that, then it's not as bad, but it's still nowhere near enjoyable. But if you think that seemed bad, take a look at the second route you can go down. This route is a lot worse. It's also a bunch of linear hallways with spammed enemies, but this time you open up gates in these hallways, which also opens up these cells with a bunch of knights that walk out into the cramped hallway. And in addition to this, behind the gate you open up, there's almost always a fire lizard statue that spews fireballs at you. And this route isn't even a faster way to the boss, and yet it's called a shortcut for some reason. As for the boss, the Smurf Demon's okay, I guess, but since he's just a reskin of the Smelter Demon with some more delayed attacks and weird hitboxes, I don't think I can praise or criticize this one too heavily. But yeah, overall this area is a lot shorter than the Frigid Outskirts, as it takes just about a minute to successfully run through all of it, but that 1 minute isn't really all that much more enjoyable. Hence why I put it at number 29 on the list. Moving on to number 28, we've got the Shrine of Amana. Now this area is a lot more interesting looking than the other 2 areas before it, and I must say it looks very gorgeous. The use of colors is absolutely on point here, and it's a nice breath of fresh air after the bleakness of the game leading up to it. And that's all the positive stuff I have to say about this area, because good God, it's like they tried being as annoying as possible with this area. The first part of this area isn't all that bad, but you'll immediately notice something that will become a very major problem with Shrine of Amana: the water. It slows your movement down, which might not be a fully bad thing so long as that rule also applied to the enemies, and it doesn't. The enemies move at normal speed inside the water while you're slowed down, and if it's just one enemy at a time, maybe this might not be all that terrible, except it's not just one enemy at a time. There's a bunch of enemy ganks inside the water that'll make their way to you while you're barely even able to move around, and they have the full capability to run laps around you. Thankfully, the first little bit of Shrine of Amana doesn't really have all that much of the stuff I just listed, but as soon as you reach the second bonfire, everything amps up by 1000%. Not only will you be exposed to the enemy ganks in this area with some truly unfortunate placement of the enemies as well, you'll also find that there are a bunch of enemies just hidden underneath the water because, well, screw you, I guess. And even still, there's another even worse thing with the enemies in this area. And that is, there's a bunch of spellcasters spammed everywhere in Shrine of Amana who constantly send out this one spell that not only has pretty dodgy hitboxes, but tracks your movement by a pretty good amount as well. I wouldn't be complaining about these enemies so much if it wasn't for the fact that they are literally everywhere. And if you get frustrated trying to take it slow in Shrine of Amana like I tend to, You might try to rush through all of it, but that is an absolutely horrible idea. Seriously, I do not recommend running through this area at all. On top of all of this, there's also a bunch of ground you need to walk on that's partially obscured by the water, which might not sound like a huge deal, but it's extremely unclear when the ground actually ends, so unless you're paying attention to every tiny detail, chances are you're gonna fall off one of the ledges and die like me. As for the boss, the Demon of Song looks pretty cool, but he is also pretty terrible in terms of gameplay. Not really much to say about this fight, but one thing I do want to mention that gets very annoying is the fact that right at the start of his boss run back, there's all of these bugs and one giant bug which spray mist at you that breaks all of your equipment. This is just such an aggravating and completely unnecessary design choice. Hell, when I was playing this game and my cat Charlotte walked into the room, even she seemed annoyed at what was going on. So overall, even though this area looks pretty, it is mind-meltingly frustrating to play in, and it is quite terrible, earning it the number 28 spot on this list. And you know what? After being so negative, let's just look at Charlotte again. I may be using this as an excuse to show her off to some people I don't know on the internet, but come on, look at her. She's so adorable. Number 27, The Cave of the Dead. God, this one sucks. This area is literally just a cave with a bunch of randomly placed hallways and a lot of small statues which bust a nut all over you from all directions. And not only does their jizz briefly stun you, but it also builds up petrification, which instantly kills you if it fully builds up. As if that wasn't already enough, the Cave of the Dead decided to do us one better by spamming a bunch of enemies all over the place. Never has an area been so appropriately named, because just look at this complete and utter catastrophe right here. What were they smoking when they designed this area? Your punishment for reaching the end of the Cave of the Dead is the Gang Squad, which takes the spot as being my second worst boss in the game, and there's only one other one that you might be seeing a good bit later on that I think tops it. And should you die at any point, you'll just be thrown right back to the start of the area, and you'll just have to run through all the petrification jizzing statues all over again. The only reason this area wasn't put below Shrine of Amana is just because this area is extremely short. So overall, this area is absolutely terrible, and that's why I decided to put it at number 27 on the list. Number 26, The Memory of the Old Iron King. This area is the optional finale to the Crown of the Old Iron King DLC, and let's just say it leaves a lot to be desired. In terms of level design, there's pretty much nothing to this area. It's just a linear path that takes you to the boss at the end. But on the way, not only will there be a bunch of spammed Alon Knights, but there will also be a bunch of fire-spitting lizards who just make the area an absolute hell. If this sounds like it's hell to experience when trying to run through the area, just you try to fight the enemies normally. It is just not worth it, so I usually sprint through this area. This area is admittedly very short, but it's still pretty cancerous in that little bit of time. Literally the only good thing the Memory of the Old Iron King has going for it is Sir Alon, because even with this area being a pretty terrible boss run back, I still think that Sir Alon is one of the best bosses in the game. But sadly, even Sir Alon isn't enough to redeem this absolute dumpster fire of an area, so I can't put it any higher than number 26 on the list. Coming in at number 25, we've got the Black Gulch. This area actually has a lot in common with the Cave of the Dead. It's extremely short and quick to run through, there's a lot of very badly placed enemies, and there's a bunch of statues who, once again, jizz all over you from all directions. Except these statues seem to have caught in some sort of serious disease or something like that, because instead of petrifying you, they poison you, which isn't really all that much better to deal with. I seriously don't know what they were thinking when they were designing this main path. And besides, even if you don't want to run through it and decide to just play through the area normally, it takes roughly 20 minutes to destroy all the poison statues. And besides the main path, the only other bit of content to this area really is just this one room you can drop down to with two giants in them that you can fight. And even then, the giants aren't very enjoyable to fight because their hitboxes are definitely a bit weird. And with the boss, I'd say that the Rotten is a pretty decent fight. It's nothing really special in terms of gameplay, but it definitely could have been a lot worse. And speaking of which, this brings me to one of the very, very few positives with the Black Gulch. Right behind a petrified hollow, they actually put a bonfire right before the boss fight, meaning that there's practically no run back at all, which is the only reason I put it above Memory of the Old Iron King. So overall, this area is pretty horrible, but thankfully, you won't have to run through it again once you reach the second bonfire. Hence why I put it at number 25 on the list. Number 24, the Dark Chasm of Old. This area is kind of unique because it's the only one in the game that's locked behind a covenant, and if you want to fight the boss of the area, you don't have to go through one Dark Chasm of Old, you have to go through 3 Dark Chasms of Old, and the one you complete last will serve as the run back to the boss. In terms of level design, again, there's not really very much to say. It's pretty much just a straight gauntlet with a bunch of NPCs and some regular enemies that takes you to the end of it. Your goal in each Dark Chasm of Old is to light the torches in the area. However, since there are no other fire sources in the area, you'll have to have a flame butterfly with you, and if you run out, then oh well. Now, on its own, the Dark Chasm of Old is still bad, but not really as much as the other ones I've listed before it. However, the thing that bumps it down right into the awful tier is this one tiny little thing about the area that may be pretty small, but is a pretty horrible choice from the developers. If you die at any point in the Dark Chasms of Old, not only will you have to start from the beginning, but it'll also cost you 1 human effigy to re-enter, and if you run out, you could very well end up farming them for quite a while. Not only is this a baffling and completely unnecessary choice, but it also makes the area much more frustrating because of the risk of running out of human effigies. Thankfully though, at least in the boss department, this area honestly isn't bad because the one boss at the end of the area is Dark Lurker, and Dark Lurker is by far the best boss outside of the DLC, and it's a genuinely fantastically designed boss. But even though I may love Dark Lurker and think he's a really great boss, he's still not enough to raise the position of this area in the list, and that effigy tax earned it the number 24 spot on the list. But thankfully, we've covered all of the awful areas in the game. The next areas that'll be after this one are still bad, but they don't actively make Dark Souls 2 a worse game, so I put them all in the bad tier. Coming in at number 23, we've got the Harvest Valley. The first half of this area is pretty much just a straight line to the second bonfire, but on that path there's a bunch of poison gas all over the place. and it is avoidable. However, they decide to put in a bunch of loot to try and lure you in it, and if I'm being honest, the loot isn't even that good, so it's really not worth dealing with the poison along with the enemies inside the gas. After that little section, there's this other little section in this canyon-like part with a bunch of desert pyromancers. I don't usually have a lot of trouble with this section of the area, but sometimes it can be admittedly annoying. After you reach the second bonfire, you'll just go through this one part above some poison gas. However, right after the room with the bonfire, there's a bunch of crystal lizards with 3 holes in the ground that leads to a maze of poison gas. And trust me, you really don't want to chase the lizards down there, because not only will you get pretty much instantly poisoned, but you also won't be able to see where you're going at all because the poison gas blocks your vision. So based on everything I'm saying, this area sounds like it belongs in the awful tier, but I put it in the bad tier because it's extremely easy just to run past everything. And again, I don't think it actively makes Dark Souls 2 a worse game. All the areas in awful tier do, but the areas in bad tier, while not being enjoyable, don't drag down the quality of the game overall. And plus, this area isn't a boss run back either, because there's not even a boss at the end of it. You just move on to the Earthern Peak. And speaking of the Earthern Peak, since it hasn't appeared yet on the list, I guess you could say I think Harvest Valley is worse, but, well, not to have any spoilers, but the Earthern Peak just might be the next area, so yeah, I don't exactly think the difference between Harvest Valley and Earthern Peak is notable. And at number 22, we've got the Earthern Peak. See? I told you this would be the next area on the list. Whenever you first enter the area, you'll almost immediately be greeted with a boss fight, the Covetous Demon. I honestly don't even know what to say about him because, well, he's literally just a fat dragon who's barely even able to move. I genuinely have no idea how you're meant to die to it, seeing as it's pretty much just a glorified soul pinata. After you defeat the Covetous Demon, you gain access to the rest of the Earthern Peak. I'm really not a fan of the enemies in this area, especially the mannequins, and there's also a bunch of jars around, and once you break them, it's pretty much instant poison. And for some reason, the mannequins also inflict poison. Like, I get it, From Software really likes putting in poison areas for some reason, but this is a bit overkill, don't you think? Aside from everything to do with the poison, the Earthern Peak isn't terrible, but it's also completely disinteresting and bland. It's pretty much just a vertical line to the boss at the end. And, well, speaking of that boss, Mytha is an extremely mediocre fight, and she's also connected to what is by far the most baffling moment in this entire area. If you go straight to her without exploring around the area at all, you'll see that there's a poison pool active, which not only constantly damages you, but heals her. But if you set fire to this metal windmill, then it'll shut off the poison pool completely. And there is absolutely no prompt, developer message, or anything to let you know that you can do this. Like, they expect you to just know that you can light it on fire when you approach it. And this area also has what is to date the most bizarre and nonsensical piece of world design in the entire Souls series. You see, after Mytha's boss fight, you enter into this elevator at the top of the windmill, and you ride up it a decent bit, and at the very top of the elevator, you step out into Iron Keep. What? And at number 21, we have the gutter. Now, compared to the areas that have come before it, the level design is actually kinda interesting, and the progression of the area isn't really all that bad since it's not just one linear path. But is the area as a whole actually any good? Well, if you ask me, no. It's pretty dull. Now, one of the main things with this area is that when you first enter it, it's going to be extremely dark. What you're meant to do is light up your own torch and light all the other torches you pass along the way. That way it'll not only be easier to see, but you'll also be able to see where you have and haven't been so far. I actually like this idea of using the torch as an essential part of an area because of how underutilized it is in-game, but with the gutter, I wish they did more with this idea because as it stands, it's still pretty trivial to the overall area. And plus, there aren't any really fun enemy encounters. There's two enemies you'll be seeing throughout the area. The first and most common is just the basic hollows, which are not only very easy to fight, but very boring to fight, and the other are these weird skinless tiger things, which I have no strong feelings on. Aside from these two enemies, the only other thing that will be a threat to you throughout the area are the poison statues from the Black Gulch, which, if I'm being honest, feel very out of place here, because there's pretty much nothing else poison related in the gutter. Aside from the lack of challenging and fun enemy encounters, I just don't really like the gutter's atmosphere, because, well, in my opinion at least, the gutter doesn't really have any atmosphere. Mostly this is because of just how boring the area looks. It's pretty much all just planks of wood and a dark backdrop. It's just very dull to look at, the area itself is pretty boring, and I can't even be relieved when it's over because, well, the Black Gulch is right after it. So, in summary, the gutter is basically a poor man's version of Blighttown with absolutely none of the atmosphere, which is why I put it at number 21 on the list. Number 20, Iron Keep. I've seen this area getting trashed on a ton by other YouTubers, and to be honest, while I don't find it to be enjoyable, I think it's kind of hated for the wrong reasons. Mainly, this area has a lot of enemies placed together at once. A lot of people tend to call it unfair and bullshit. Me, on the other hand, as long as you take this area slow, it isn't really all that frustrating for me. But the reason I still don't like it is because of just how tedious it gets. Clearing out the Iron Keep's enemies just isn't fun. I don't think it's necessarily unfair, as I've already said, but it's still not really enjoyable. And this very ganky enemy design is very prevalent in the first part of this area. You probably already know what part I'm talking about. The run to the Smelter Demon has become pretty infamous for being a pretty awful gangbang if you try to run through it. If you go slow, it's already pretty tedious like I mentioned, but if you try to run past it, it can be annoying. I managed to get lucky on this playthrough, but every single time I try running past it after dying to the Smelter Demon, I usually end up getting killed at least a few times. As for the Smelter Demon, I actually like this boss. I don't have anything negative to say. But after that boss fight, the rest of the Iron Keep isn't terrible, but it's not good either. It boils down to basically just being a linear line to the next boss, with the only interesting segment being this one little bit where you can dip some enemies into lava. Fun fact, by the way, when I was getting footage for this video, somebody actually invaded me. And before they could start fighting me, I ended up getting killed. But when I'd gotten back to about the spot where I died, I saw that before I died, the invader had dropped not only a +5 Drangleic shield, but also about 53 human effigies. And to that dude, if you're watching this video, seriously, thank you for that. It was very helpful when getting footage for this video, especially with areas like the Dark Chasm of old. And when it comes to the boss at the end of the area, the Old Iron King looks really cool, but man, his fight sucks. With everything having been said, I actually like the aesthetic of this place. It looks more like Bowser's Castle than an area in Dark Souls, and I quite like it. But overall, the area just really isn't fun for me to play through, and so I decided to put it at number 20 on the list. Coming in at number 19, we've got the Doors of Pharos. I'm supposed to say something else to introduce this area, but really, what is there to say? It sucks! There's two ways you can go when you enter the area. One of them will lead you to Brightstone Cove Saldora, a required area, and the other one will lead you to the rest of the Doors of Pharos. Mostly, this area is very linear, with the lower sections taking place half submerged in water, and once you're done with the lower water submerged parts, you'll enter the upper section of this area. Now, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with linear level design. I mean, take a look at Irithyll of the Boreal Valley from Dark Souls 3. That is a genuinely fantastic area, and it's pretty linear in its level design. But that would imply that the Doors of Pharos really has any level design. It's a very bland, straightforward path, and it only has a single thing to make it stand out, and that is the, well, Doors of Pharos. And, well, none of them are worth opening at all. Sometimes the loot can be pretty bad, sometimes there's enemies behind the doors, and a lot of times there's just straight up nothing. And while the upper parts have decent enough enemy placement, the lower parts with the water are pretty trash, especially with those dog rat things that can apply toxic. Seriously, what were they thinking when they were designing those enemies? On top of all of this, the Doors of Pharos also has the displeasure of having the absolute worst boss in the game. The Royal Rat Authority. Just... God, there is genuinely nothing good about this fight. It is a god-awful boss and everyone knows it. But overall, this area really isn't horrible, but it's very forgettable and disappointing in its lack of, well, anything really. And so that's why I decided to put it at number 19 on the list. Number 18, Grave of Saints. Just like Doors of Pharos, I'm really struggling to find something to say about this area because, well, it sucks. And it's by far the most bland and disinteresting area in the entire game. When you enter the area, you'll go through a couple rooms and a couple very bland looking hallways, and both of those things are filled with rats. Yeah, that's literally all there is to it, with the only real exception being these Pharos contraptions which spit out acid. At least they put a bonfire before the boss, but then again that boss is Royal Rat Vanguard, so, it exists, I guess? It's literally just a room full of rats. That's pretty much what the fight boils down to. I have nothing positive to say about it. After Royal Rat Vanguard, you'll drop down a few platforms and into this one room where you'll go down a little hallway and then it's over. There's nothing else in the area to find. That's pretty much it. The Grave of Saints just feels very unfinished, almost more like a filler area than an actual level. Again, it's not really frustrating, but it's just, well, nothing. In fact, just why am I still talking about this place? There's nothing worth discussing. Other than, I guess, with this area, we've finally covered all of the bad areas of Dark Souls 2. The next couple of areas are going to be the mediocre ones. Then, after the mediocre ones, we'll move on to the ones that are actually okay. Then after that, the genuinely good areas. Then we'll look at the great ones until we get to the number 1 best area of the game. And kicking off the mediocre tier at number 17, we've got the Undead Crypt. If I sound clinically depressed when describing the mediocre areas, not only is this what I'm like in real life, which, to clarify for any of my close friends or family who might be watching this video, in that case, shout out to you, that was meant as a joke. But along with this, these areas are so bland and forgettable that I can't even really get excited when talking about them. The Undead Crypt at least has a few interesting ideas going for it. The first of these ideas is that whenever you enter the area, you're told by an NPC not to light the torches inside the area despite it being dark. Now, if you do light the torches, it'll be a little bit easier to see, but it's really not worth dealing with the invaders that'll spawn in afterwards. The second neat concept it has going for it is the whole enemy spawning gimmick. Now, in these little graveyard rooms, there are some bells that if you hit them, they'll start ringing. The goal is not to accidentally hit the bells, because if you accidentally hit the bells, then there'll be a bunch of enemies that get spawned because of it. Now, this gimmick sounds like it could be very interesting, but they kind of botched its execution because the enemies can also ring the bells. And while the Undead Crypt does the whole gimmick of lighting the torches pretty okay, there's not much else it really does that great. It's completely disinteresting, even down to its visuals. Now, this area actually has 2 bosses, one of which is required and the other is optional. The mandatory boss is Velstadt, and okay, I can break out of the clinical depression for this commentary on the boss, because, hey, Velstadt is a really, really well-made fight, and I like it a good bit. But now the clinical depression's coming back because I have to talk about Vendrick, which...
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Yeah, let's just say that Vendrick isn't really, well, you know, on par with Velstadt. So, overall, the Undead Crypt is an area that has 2 cool concepts going for it, but a very weak execution, and nothing else interesting to back it up, making the whole thing just feel pretty mediocre for me. Honestly, the mediocre tier segments are probably the hardest to record in the whole video, because I mean, I just can't really find that much to say. You could completely switch around the order of these mediocre areas and I wouldn't really care. I'm just indifferent. Coming in at number 16, we've got Hyde's Tower of Flame. Now, from what I've seen, a lot of people really like Hyde's Tower of Flame because of its aesthetics. And I will say, the area really is beautiful. But although I really do value good visuals and atmosphere, I also highly value gameplay. And, well, Hyde's Tower of Flame really isn't all that remarkable in terms of gameplay. The level design in Hyde's Tower of Flame pretty much boils down to it being a straightforward and linear path that forks towards the end of it, and all along the path you'll fight one enemy at a time. The Old Knights are pretty decent enemies for being so early in the game at least, seeing as this is one of the first areas you'll come across. Once you get towards the end of the area, there's going to be a fork in the road. Both paths created by this fork will lead you to its own respective boss fight. The first of these two paths leads you not only to No Man's Wharf, but a fight against the Dragon Rider, which is a pretty mediocre boss. But once you kill him, not only will you gain access to No Man's Wharf, but the dormant enemies littering the area known as the Hide Knights will actually wake up and become aggressive. This sounds really cool on paper, but in reality it's not really a good thing at all because the Hide Knights are very absurdly janky to try and fight. And on top of that, they just make the run back to the other boss, the old Dragon Slayer, even worse than it already was. And while we're on the topic of the old Dragon Slayer's run back, why From Software? Why did you have to put a dragon obstacle here? Seriously, just look at this footage. What were you thinking by putting this dragon here? It's completely unnecessary and makes this run back even worse. And as for the old Dragon Slayer itself, it's literally just Ornstein from Dark Souls 1, but without Smo. And man, I wish that fat McDonald's addicted executioner was here in the fight, because Ornstein by himself is kinda pathetic. But even with this fight being a joke, I still think it's kinda okay. Nothing special, but kinda okay. And with Hyde's Tower of Flame overall, I think it looks really pretty, but it's pretty dull in terms of gameplay, so I decided to put it in mediocre tier. Sliding right on into the number 15 spot, we've got Aldia's Keep. You might be a little surprised I decided to put this area in mediocre tier, since from what I can tell, a lot of people really seem to like this area. One of the most praised aspects of this area from what I can tell is its whole vibe it has going for it. And I will say, I do like the atmosphere of this area. The moment where you enter Aldia's Keep, seeing this giant mansion in the woods with fog around it towering over you, stepping into this giant room with a huge dragon skeleton in it, and then entering the hallway with all of Aldia's experiments, that stuff is pretty cool. But in terms of gameplay, I will say I do think Aldia's Keep is kind of dull. Most of the level boils down to just being one hallway with rooms on either side of it pretty much, and there isn't really all that much content to explore. And with the content the area offers, while some of it is pretty cool, most of it is kind of lackluster, and doesn't really hold up to the hype this area gets in my opinion. But I can't really put it in bad tier because, again, I really like the whole mad scientist vibe it has going for it. And on top of that, I don't really think the area is all that bad to go through. And as for the boss, the Guardian Dragon kinda sucks. No surprise there. I don't think I've seen anybody who actually likes this boss, so yeah. But overall, Aldia's Keep really isn't horrible, but it's kind of lackluster, and when I go through it, I just can't help but feel sad thinking about how good it could have been. And that's why I decided to put it at number 15. And at number 14, we've got the Giant's Memories. This area is a little interesting because, well, I genuinely couldn't decide whether to consider it as mediocre or if I should consider it as being okay. On one hand, the fact that they are literally memories of dead giants that you access late in the game is really cool, and it has its own separate vibe and identity from the rest of the game. But on the other, it's also got the giant enemies with weird hitboxes. But then on the other hand, the level design here is pretty alright. But then, on the other hand, they're extremely short. But then, on the other hand, they're a pretty reliable way to get giant souls. So, do you see my point? The giant memories have a lot of good things going for them, and a lot of not so good things going for them. So I decided to just put it in between being mediocre and okay, as really, I can't say I hate or love going through the giant memories. And as for the boss, well, the Giant Lord has some pretty cool lore, but he's basically just the last giant with a sword. So, yeah, I don't really have a very positive opinion on him. But after this area, we're going to be talking about some areas that are actually kinda good, and then moving on to some truly good areas, then the great ones, the legendary areas, and then the best one. So, let's move on, shall we? And at number 13, we have Brightstone Cove Saldora. This area is divided into 3 separate segments, the first of which is this small, partially wooded area with a falconer encampment. And it ends up being the shortest of the 3 segments, as it's mostly just a path to the area's first boss, the Prowling Magus and Congregation. From what I can tell, a lot of people seem to really despise this boss fight, and while I will say maybe it's a little unnecessary as a boss fight, I actually kinda like it a little bit. I mean, I don't think it's amazing or anything, but it's okay. Once the Prowling Magus and Congregation have been defeated, you'll gain access to the second zone within Brightstone Cove Saldora, that being the spider-infested mining village. I find that this part of the area has pretty good atmosphere. The exploration is definitely pretty fun, and it has a non-linear progression style that I think works very well. And in addition to this, I think the level design within this village is pretty well made. So far, Brightstone Cove Saldora sounds like it belongs in good or great tier. However, I decided to put it in okay tier because of 2 main reasons. One of the reasons is pretty minor, and the other is a bit more important. The more minor reason is the visuals of Saldora. I for one tend to actually kind of appreciate grayscale, low saturation color palettes, but I don't feel like that kind of color paletting was utilized very well here, and it ends up with the area looking kind of bad. But the more important reason I decided to put this area in okay tier instead of good or great is because of how the spiders work. You see, they'll always be aggroed unless you're holding a torch in your hand, and if you're holding a torch, they'll slowly back away from you. But the reason why I'm calling out this mechanic is because this area does not do a good job at hinting to you that this even works. And if you go in without a torch, it's not a very good experience, especially in the Spider Mansion towards the end of the village section. The final section in Brightstone Cove Saldora is this one massive dark cavern with a bunch of spider webs that leads you down to the boss. While it's nothing really special, I think it does a good job at building you up towards the boss, and it is kind of fun to play through. And as for the boss, I really like the visual design of the Duke's Dear Freya, but it's a bit of a snooze fest when it comes to the actual fight. So overall with Brightstone Cove Saldora, I think that they could have explained how the spiders work a lot better, and the area does look kinda boring, but I do find it to be fun on subsequent playthroughs, hence why I decided to put it in okay tier. Number 12, the Shaded Woods. This area is one that tends to get a lot of hate from the Dark Souls 2 community, but to be honest, I kinda like this area. One thing I especially appreciate about the Shaded Woods is how much it improves this game's world design. The area feels interconnected with a bunch of other areas because not only does it connect you to Majula, your main hub area, but it also connects you to Drangleic Castle, Doors of Pharos, Aldia's Keep, and kind of frozen Liam Loyce. But even with interconnectivity aside, I still think that on its own, the Shaded Woods is a pretty decent level. The area starts out on a fairly linear path towards the second bonfire, which I will admit isn't all that fun to play in. Although I will say it's not really that bad, I just think it's kinda boring. But once you reach the second bonfire, you'll find a split in the road, with two areas being connected to the split that you're meant to come back to later. The only route you're able to continue down at this exact moment is the one leading to a very misty and foggy wooded area. In this misty and foggy wooden area, you won't be able to see much in front of you, and the camera is quite zoomed in. And on top of that, there are a bunch of transparent enemies you can't lock onto in the area with you. This sounds like it would be an absolutely horrendous experience, but to be honest, I don't really mind this part of the area. It's pretty quick to get it over with, and it's nowhere near as bad as, say, Frigid Outskirts or Tomb of the Giants from Dark Souls 1. After you get past the misty, foggy wooded area, you'll access the rest of the Shaded Woods. It's a fairly short part of this level, but fairly sweet in my opinion. Although I will say I don't really like that one pit trap you can fall into where you get ganged up on by a bunch of basilisks. That part is complete ass. But thankfully you can completely skip that part since, well, you only access it if you fall down into a certain pit. And as for the boss, Scorpioness Noshka, I think she's a good boss. So overall with the Shaded Woods, I'd say it's a pretty okay area. It's nothing hugely impressive, but it's decent, earning it the number 12 spot on this list. Number 11, Things Betwixt. This is the first area of the game, and you'll enter it immediately after the opening cutscene. When you first enter, you'll have half your health bar, absolutely no weapons or items, and, well, you'll be left on your own. There's a bunch of hidden loot scattered around this first little bit of the area, as well as enemies hiding in the grass, but I like that they reward exploration in this first part of the area. Along with this, I really like this place's aesthetic. It feels very unique, and it makes the area feel like it has its own identity, and by extension, it shows right from the get-go that Dark Souls 2 has its own unique feel and atmosphere compared to the rest of the games. After you get through this little bit of the zone, you'll enter this small house where a bunch of old women laugh at you, and after that, you'll be allowed to create your character. This is a pretty unique setup for a tutorial area in my opinion, and it's the only time across the Souls games where you actually start to play the game before creating your character, and I quite like this divergence away from what we would expect at this point. Once you've created your character, that's when the real tutorial begins though. It's mostly just one straight path with rooms on either side, but those rooms teach you how to play the game basically. And I also like that you can tackle them in any order, and so overall, I like Things Betwixt. It's a pretty short area, but I think it's a really good tutorial area, and fairly solid as its own level, earning it the number 11 spot on the list. Number 10, No Man's Wharf. No Man's Wharf has a very well-made pirate-type atmosphere going for it, and I gotta say, I really like the whole pirate vibe. It feels very different from a lot of the other areas in Dark Souls 2. The enemies you'll be encountering in this area are mostly Hollow Varagians, which I think are pretty good enemies, and they're really fun to fight. But that also brings me to one of the few negatives with this area. The enemy placement can get pretty ganky, even by Dark Souls 2 standards. I wish the enemy placement had been cleaned up a little bit, because sometimes it can feel a little bit BS. But in addition to this, there'll also be these enemies, which genuinely make my skin crawl. And similar to the spiders in Brightstone Cove Tseldora, they can be warded off using a torch. But unlike in that area, They're a pretty minor part of No Man's Wharf, so I can't really drag it down too much for not hinting the torch mechanic very well. Your goal throughout most of No Man's Wharf is to reach the bell so that way you can call this ghost ship over to dock and fight the boss. I think that this goal was executed pretty decently, although I wish there was more than one shortcut in the area because that one shortcut is all the way at the end before the boss. Don't get me wrong, it is pretty helpful, but I wish that there was more than one of them because, well, aside from the boss, if you die at any point, you'll just have to run all the way back. And while we're on the topic of the boss, I think the Flexile Sentry is a pretty good boss fight for the early game and is pretty decent all around. So overall, No Man's Wharf is definitely a flawed area, don't get me wrong, but even with its flaws, I still really enjoy the area, hence why I decided to put it at number 10. Coming in at number 9, we've got the Lost Bastille. This area actually has two ways of reaching it. The first way is by reaching the end of No Man's Wharf and taking the ship to this area. The second way of reaching the Lost Bastille is by beating the Pursuer in the Forest of Fallen Giants and climbing into a bird's nest. The route from the Forest of Fallen Giants isn't really all that remarkable, so for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to mostly be talking about the route from No Man's Wharf. You'll start off in a cell block before going down this very pretty looking little path into this one small courtyard where you can encounter the Pursuer again. The enemy placement mostly seems to be pretty good and well considered, especially for Dark Souls 2. And as mentioned earlier, the outside bits of this area are very pretty, which is quite nice, and the area has very good atmosphere in my opinion. After this little courtyard section, you'll go up this one path only to find you can't really progress any further because there's a petrified hollow in front of you. However, by doing a little more exploring around and fighting the Pursuer again, you can find a fragrant branch of yore, which allows you to proceed. I like this style of non-linear progression for the area, and I think it was executed quite well. But after you get rid of that petrified hollow, you'll go to fight the first of the area's 3 bosses, the Ruined Sentinels. This is definitely the best boss within the Lost Bastille, and it's a really fun and well-designed gank fight. I love this one. The optional boss you can access directly after the Ruined Sentinels is the Belfry Gargoyles, and it's okay, I guess. It feels kind of like a ripoff of the Bell Gargoyles, though. The rest of the Lost Bastille is still pretty good, though. It has really on-point level design, pretty good atmosphere as mentioned earlier, and well thought out enemy placement for the most part. And it's also really great if you love to explore areas down to the last little centimeter like I do. At the end of the Lost Bastille, you'll fight the Lost Sinner. It's a fight that's nothing too crazy, but it's a very fun duel that gets the job done. So overall, I like the Lost Bastille. It's a very solid level, and it's always fun on repeat playthroughs, earning it the number 9 spot on the list. Number 8, the Dragonary. This is the area directly after Aldia's Keep, and you might be surprised to see it so high up on the list, seeing as even with its really good visuals, it is pretty mediocre in terms of level design. But honestly, I don't fault this area for that. This area is one of the last ones you'll ever encounter in the game, and it almost feels rewarding to just stroll along through it. The area, as you can see in the footage, looks very beautiful, and I really enjoy the ambience of it. Something about it is just so relaxing. There's also some really cool moments, such as seeing a bunch of sleeping dragons with their eggs, and things like that. But overall, I I just really like this area. I know this segment is easily the shortest one, but I just don't really have a lot to say. So overall, this area is good, earning it the number 8 spot on the list. And at number 7, we've got the Dragon Shrine. Now, this area is super small and comes directly after the Dragon Area, so maybe I should have considered it as part of the Dragon Area, but I felt that it was different enough to count it separately. And as its own thing, Dragon Shrine still holds up extremely well. What you're meant to do is kill all of the Drakekeeper Knights in the area so that way the other enemies in the area won't attack you. I find that the Drakekeeper Knights are pretty fun to fight, and along with this, I like their slow, deliberate, yet very powerful attacks. And along with this, all of the other enemies in the area are also really fun to fight, making it so that even if you decide not to kill the Drakekeeper Knights, you'll still have a good time in the area. The enemy placement as well is also quite well executed. It feels very deliberate and thought out, and I really like how the enemies were placed around the map. It feels very well balanced, and I don't remember a single time where I actually felt that the area was unfair. Obviously, it goes without saying that this area is very gorgeous looking, and in combination with this, I think that the level design is pretty good, even if it's kind of simple. And I like that there are a few cool secrets on the side as well, rewarding exploration. The boss at the end of this area that you can choose to fight or not to fight is the Ancient Dragon. And, well, I know most people dislike it, but I don't think very many people despise it in the same way I do. It's definitely one of the worst bosses in this game. Screw the Ancient Dragon. And it also brings me to one of the few negatives with this area, because not only is it a garbage boss fight and super hard for all the wrong reasons, but there are no shortcuts leading up to it, meaning that if you die to it at any point, you go all the way back. But even with that absolute dumpster fire of a boss at the end and the terrible run back to it, I still really enjoy Dragon Shrine, so I decided to put it at number 7 on the list and in the great tier. Coming right on in at number 6, we've got Huntsman's Copse. Let's start out with one of my favorite things about Huntsman's Copse, the atmosphere. I don't know what it is about the atmosphere, but it just clicks with me. Something about the dim yellow-green sky, birds off in the distance, the silhouette of the trees that you can't reach, ominous fortress looming over you. Something about all of it just really does it for me. I'm also a fan of the forest setting of this area. I love my fair share of epic fantasy cities and castles just like everyone else, but sometimes it's nice to just go through a forest level for once. The level design of Huntsman's Copse is also pretty well made in my opinion. There's a side path you can take to go to the undead purgatory and fight the Executioner's Chariot, which I might as well give my commentary on. I like the concept for the Executioner's Chariot, but the fight's admittedly kind of meh in terms of execution. I'm also a fan of the derelict and abandoned building you explore towards the beginning of this area. There's no real lore about it as far as I'm aware, and it's a very minor part of the whole level, but there's just something really depressing and sinister about seeing this mansion in the dark woods. Abandoned, derelict, only inhabited by hollows. The hollows I just mentioned aren't the only enemies throughout Huntsman's Copse, though. There's also some variants of the hollows which are really good enemies in my opinion, and there's also some skeletons towards the end in this one cave section that genuinely makes my skin crawl at times. Speaking of these cave sections, if you follow a particular route in these cave sections, you'll find that you've actually looped back to the previous bonfire, which I think is some excellent level design, And, well, I guess I shouldn't expect anything less from Software, but still, it's really clever level design and I like it. This kind of content isn't all that Huntsman's Copse has to offer though, because there are a few small secret little bits that you can discover, and honestly, with the way they're implemented, I always end up second guessing myself when I'm done with the area, thinking that maybe there could be something else that I missed, even though I know that I've discovered everything in the area. And I love this kind of implementation for secrets, I seriously do. Once you reach the end of Huntsman's Copse, you'll fight the Skeleton Lords. A lot of people seem to really hate this boss for some reason, and while I don't think it's exceptionally amazing, I kinda like it. So, to summarize my thoughts, Huntsman's Copse is a fantastically well-atmosphered area with good level design, fun enemy encounters, good enemy placement, and an okay boss lineup, earning it the number 6 spot on the list. Our number 5 spot on the list goes to Drangleic Castle. Ever since the start of the game, you'll be getting dialogue about he who peered into the essence of a soul, King Vendrick. You might be wondering why I bring this up, and that's because your entire goal for the first half of the game has been to reach King Vendrick, making the moment you are about to enter Drangleic Castle honestly pretty exciting on a first playthrough. And for me, whenever I stepped out of the shaded woods and saw this gigantic, imposing castle in the rain, it was a genuinely awesome moment. When you first enter the area, you'll notice that you can't really go inside the main castle itself because the doors are completely shut. But you'll also probably notice that there are 2 large statues right beside the door, and on top of that there's a bunch of enemies coming at you. What you need to do is lure the enemies close to the statues, and then kill them right next to said statue. When you do this with both of them, they'll both come to life and open the door for you. As you can probably tell, I really like this puzzle. I think it was very creative and well executed, and the ways it's implemented throughout the rest of the area I think are pretty good. And as you can probably tell by how I described this area when I introduced it, I really love this place's aesthetic. It looks absolutely awesome and intimidating on the outside, and on the inside it feels eerie and abandoned, but still shows traces of Drangleic Castle's former glory. A huge chunk of your progression in Drangleic Castle is quite linear, but to be honest, I don't mind this. As I've said before, I don't fully mind linear level design. When done wrong, it can admittedly feel kind of bland and boring, but when done right, it can make for some really good levels. And Drangleic Castle is a great example of linear level design done right in my opinion. After getting access to the inside of the castle and then going into the basement, you'll enter this room, which has a very similar puzzle to how you entered the inside in the first place, except this time you have to guess which door it is you need to open. And I'll be honest, I'm not really a fan of this room. Obviously it makes sense that there are a lot of enemies in here, but guessing wrong will lead out a Ruin Sentinel. And you might be thinking, well, you said earlier that you love fighting the Ruin Sentinels. And yeah, I do, but this room is really not made for fighting them, especially with how many enemies are in it. So I really am not a fan of this design choice at all. Once you've solved the puzzle in that one room, you'll exit the basement and begin ascending to the top of the castle. The enemy placement in this little bit is pretty on point in my opinion, and the views from the outside are really pretty. But after reaching the end of this little section, you'll go and fight the first boss of Drangleic Castle, the Twin Dragon Riders. From what I can tell, a lot of people online seem to really hate this boss, and honestly I've just gotta ask how. I mean, I don't think it's a fantastic fight, it's pretty average in my book, but aside from it being kinda basic, I don't think the fight is that bad, jeez. After the Twin Dragon Riders, you'll enter this other little zone in Drangleic Castle that mostly revolves around a single bonfire located right by a locked door which leads you to the exit of this area. What you'll have to do is do a little bit of exploring, and on the way you'll not only get to fight the Executioner's Chariot again as a regular enemy, but you'll also see a very nice moment of level design with the level looping back in on itself again via a shortcut. What you're meant to do is solve another statue puzzle to activate this one lift, where once you reach the top of this lift, you'll enter this one room with whatever the fuck this thing is, along with the key to the locked door. Once you've entered the locked door, you'll be able to fight the second boss of Drangleic Castle, the Looking Glass Knight, which I think is an absolutely great boss, and I always enjoy fighting it a lot. And after defeating the Looking Glass Knight, you'll move on to Shrine of Amana. Believe it or not though, this isn't the end of Drangleic Castle, because right at the very end of the game, you'll come back to Drangleic Castle and enter one final subsection, the Throne of Want. It's a really short little section, mostly just one main path to the very end, and there isn't really any level design or enemy encounters in this little bit of the area. So instead, what I'm going to be focusing on is the bosses, because it's pretty much a boss rush for the final bosses of the game. The first boss of this sequence is the Throne Watcher plus Throne Defender. I think this is a really fun gank fight, and it was pretty well designed. I like this one. The second boss of this sequence is Nashandra. In the original version of Dark Souls 2, she was the final boss of the game, and I can definitely see why that left a kinda poor impression. I don't think she's bad per se, but I can definitely agree that she is a bit mediocre in terms of gameplay. But her visual design, and especially her music, are pretty good in my opinion. But in Scholar of the First Sin Edition, there's a secret boss right at the end of this sequence. A sort of true final boss of the game, if you will, and that boss is Aldia, the Scholar of the First Sin. This is a character you encounter throughout the game, and while I don't think he's necessarily fantastic in terms of gameplay, I think he's okay. But the main thing that elevates this fight for me is the whole presentation of the thing. Obviously, encountering Aldia throughout the game plays a part with the atmosphere of this fight, but I still think even aside from that, the atmosphere is pretty good. I actually kind of like his visual design as well, and not to mention his music. Aside from the boss rush, the Throne of Want in the lore relates to a lot of Dark Souls 2's main themes about avarice. I'm not really the correct person to explain all of this to you, but let's just say this little subsection in the lore is the perfect end to this game, and overall, Drangleic Castle is a pretty great area all around, earning it the number 5 spot on the list. One thing I want to say real quick, numbers 4, 3, and 2 on this list are all in a new tier I created called Legendary Tier. I did not have this tier at all in my Dark Souls 1 area ranking video, but I just want to say real quick, all of the areas in that video between number 8 and number 4 would be in Legendary Tier. But now that that's out of the way, on to the next area. And at number 4, we've got the Forest of Fallen Giants. After exiting Things Betwixt, this is very likely going to be the first area you'll encounter in the game outside of the tutorial, and honestly, I think the Forest of Fallen Giants is one of the most impressive early game areas that From Software has ever created. Before you even experience the bulk of the area, the Forest of Fallen Giants already distinguishes itself from all of the other locations in Dark Souls 2. You first enter the area by going through this small, mostly dark cave, only to step out into this bright, calm, peaceful forest with a flowing stream of water right beside you. When it comes to the Forest of Fallen Giants visuals, although I think that some of the texturing hasn't exactly aged the best, I really like its aesthetic and I still think it looks pretty. Despite what you might have been led to believe by the start of the area though, the vast majority of the Forest of Fallen Giants isn't in some wide open expanse of woods. Instead, the vast majority of this area is spent in an abandoned, derelict fortress. And honestly, I love this. As you can probably tell by this point in the video, I highly value atmosphere with my areas, and this derelict and abandoned fortress is like Atmosphere, the Dark Souls level. The ambience playing in the background of the level gives the outdoor parts a sort of peaceful and relaxing vibe to it, but at the same time, the completely ruined state of the fortress, as well as it being overrun with vegetation, gives it an almost somber type of vibe. And honestly, this somber feeling is a kind of somberness I don't even know how to properly explain. But even with this area's near flawless atmosphere aside, the level design here is absolutely immaculate as well. I genuinely believe that the Forest of Fallen Giants has some of the best level design in all of Dark Souls 2. Before you reach the second bonfire of the Forest of Fallen Giants, the area plays out in an entirely linear fashion. I don't really mind this though, and this linear path is actually pretty good in my opinion. The enemy placement is mostly pretty on point, and there's also the atmosphere, which is again, extremely great. But after you reach the Cardinal Tower bonfire, you get to explore the fortress in a half-linear, half-non-linear way. You see, there is clearly a place you're meant to get to, and a semblance of a route you're meant to choose, but it's not really restricted to just that one, and there's a lot of exploration to be had in this fortress. And man, the exploration is extremely rewarding here. The Forest of Fallen Giants has a ton of really cool secrets in it, with one of my absolute favorites being the optional Pursuer encounter before the actual battle with him. The area is already quite big, but the sheer amount of content just within this fortress always makes it feel gigantic by the time I'm finished with the level. Towards the end of the area, once you've gained access to the first of the area's 2 bosses, you'll get to see an absolutely excellent moment of level design. Up to this point, you'll probably have thought that you've gone a great distance into the fortress, only for it to be revealed that you'd gone in a complete circle, and that the boss was right next to you all along in a place you couldn't reach until now. And as for that boss, okay, the last giant is kinda bad, and it was a pretty big letdown. But after you kill the last giant, you'll go up to the top of the fortress and fight the second boss of the Forest of Fallen Giants, the Pursuer. I personally think the Pursuer is a little bit overrated, but he's definitely still a pretty fun fight, and I like him. But aside from the boss lineup with this area, I can't do anything else but gush over this amazing level. Seriously, I mean that. If I had to pick anything at all with the Forest of Fallen Giants to complain about, it would be that sometimes in some certain points, the enemy placement can get a little ganky. This is a pretty minor problem though, and I don't count it against the area too much. So overall, the Forest of Fallen Giants is one of the best early game areas From Software has ever created in my opinion. It's a phenomenal location that I love playing through every time I restart the game, earning it the number 4 spot on the list. Number 3, Frozen Ilium Lois. Out of all the areas in Dark Souls 2, Frozen Ilium Lois has one of my favorite setups for it. When you first enter the area, the entire city is engulfed in a blinding snowstorm and you can immediately go and fight a boss, only to find that that boss is completely invisible. What you're supposed to do instead of fighting the boss right away is to go and explore the city. This first part of the level has what is undeniably my favorite atmosphere in all of Dark Souls 2. It really feels long abandoned, eerie, and isolated, and I absolutely love it. Your progression in this part of the level is for the most part pretty linear, but on the way to the end of this section, you might notice a good few little paths that are completely blocked off to you via ice. You'll want to keep this in mind for later, trust me. But after you reach the end of this section of the level, you'll receive an item that allows you to see the area's first boss. So you'll go back to his arena and try to fight him again. And I've gotta say, Ava is a really fun boss in my opinion. I like it. But before we move on from the blizzard-enshrouded part of Frozen Ilium Lois, I just wanted to show a clip of one of the most Dark Souls moments that's ever happened to me, if that makes sense. Here it is. And just to clarify, that was not another player. It is an NPC who is scripted to invade you in Frozen Ilium Lois, and honestly, I just think this invasion is pretty amusing. Once you defeat Ava though, you'll encounter Alsana, one of the shards of Manus you'll encounter throughout the DLCs, and in this case, the wife of the old Ivory King. After her giving a bit of lore explanation for what's going on with this place, she'll unfreeze the area essentially, and open up all the frozen off paths you saw before, while also making it much easier to see by getting rid of the snowstorm. Your objective for the second half of Frozen Ilium Lois is to explore around the city again, this time going through the paths that were previously blocked off to you, to find the Lois Knights. That way you can go and fight the area's final boss. Since the snowstorm is completely gone in this part of the level, I feel like I can finally address the visuals of Frozen Ilium Lois, and I have both positive and negative things to say about them. Firstly, I love the aesthetic of this place. The outside areas are really pretty to look at, and they're really great in my opinion. But on the other hand, the indoor sections are pretty much all just a bunch of empty, dull-looking gray brick rooms, and I'm not hugely a fan of this. All of the indoor sections look incredibly bland to me, which is a pretty big shame. But there's a much bigger problem with this area's visuals that drags it down much more than it would for any other area. For a lot of the particular rooms or segments within Frozen Ilium Lois, there's a pretty big lack of variety with standout features. There's your snowy outdoor bridge, then there's the gray brick indoor hallway, snowy outdoor place with a fountain. You get the gist. The main reason this is such a big issue for me is because of how you find the Lois Knights, seeing as you'll have to go through areas that had frozen off paths at first. The extreme lack of variation in terms of visuals throughout the area means it can be very hard to remember where the ice even was, dragging out the time you spend in this area for no real good reason in my opinion. Now, this isn't a huge deal on repeat playthroughs in my opinion, since even when I went to record footage for this video, I had already had the map design committed to memory. However, it is very questionable on first time playthroughs, so I wanted to kinda bring it up. And when it comes to the level design, Frozen Ilium Lois is freaking huge, so don't expect me to go down into specifics too much with this segment, but I think the level design here is extremely good. Some of the best in Dark Souls 2, in fact. Every single time I beat Frozen Ilium Lois, I'm always left wondering if I really found everything in the area, and that's just because of how much content there is and how good the level design is. And that is always very impressive for an area, and so I think it really has fantastic level design. And then, once you've finished everything else in Frozen Ilium Lois, you'll go and face off against the Burnt Ivory King. This boss is absolutely amazing. It's got really fun gameplay, it's got a fantastic spectacle, and some of the best lore for a boss in the series in my opinion. So, in short, I love it. And I also love Frozen Ilium Lois, and that's why I've put it at number 3. And at number 2, we've got Shulva the Sanctum City. Before I even say anything else about this area, just look at this view when you enter. Oh, this is easily the most beautiful area in the entire game, and it's not even a competition. I might as well do all my gushing about the visuals right at the start of this area so I can get it out of the way, because literally every single inch of this area is absolutely breathtaking. Seriously, I love this place's visuals. And not only is the area absolutely beautiful looking, and not only does it have my favorite aesthetic in the game, but it also has what is by far the most unique look to it. I can genuinely say that I've never seen anything else quite like Shulva. And as for everything outside of the visuals of this area, it's almost as though everything that makes me love Dark Souls 2 all came together in this one level, as well as our number 1 spot, but we'll get to that later. You start out at the very top of the area and actually work your way down through a bunch of paths within the city itself at the very beginning. The enemy placement here is extremely on point. There's a lot of enemies at once at some points, but it never really feels unfair to manage in my opinion, which is absolutely great. And it also never gets super tedious to clear them out as well. I also absolutely love the idea of these pillars being able to be raised or lower with these switches here. It's pretty creative, and I kinda wish it was utilized a bit more, but hey, what do I know? After reaching the end of this little series of walkways, you'll get a nice visit from Sin the Slumbering Dragon before entering where you'll spend most of your time in the level, and that is the Dragon Sanctum. If I could really summarize my thoughts on Dragon Sanctum in one sentence, it would be, Dragon Sanctum is Sen's Fortress but better in literally every single way possible. But well, you didn't come here to hear one sentence of commentary, so hey, I'm gonna do an actual analysis of this part of the area because that's what you came here for. Similarly to how you entered Shulva, you'll start out very high up in the Dragon Sanctum and gradually make your way down to the base of it. I know I've said with a lot of areas leading up to Shulva that they have some of the best level design in the game, but Shulva is directly tied with the #1 spot for having the absolute best level design in all of Dark Souls 2. Seriously. And this especially shines in the Dragon Sanctum sub-area because, man, they went all out here. This place is very big and can be confusing to traverse because it's laid out in a sort of maze-like way. This place really is an absolute labyrinth, and this isn't a bad thing at all in my opinion. It was executed very well and it's very fun to explore around in. One of my absolute favorite video game series of all time is The Legend of Zelda, and the reason I bring this up in a video about Dark Souls is because, well, Dragon Sanctum feels like it would be right at home in a Zelda game. It could even be a pretty good dungeon, honestly. And just like the rest of Shulva, the Dragon Sanctum has some really good enemy placement as well. It can get ganky at several points in the Dragon Sanctum, but at those points the enemies are placed not to just all bum rush you at the same time, and are placed instead to encourage a more slow and methodical approach to the area, and I honestly think that they did good enough in the execution. And while I do think there are a lot of areas with better atmospheres than the Dragon Sanctum, the singing coming from deep within the sanctum itself adds a lot of atmosphere to this part of Shulva. And finally, after obtaining the Dragonstone and making it through a part of Shulva with enough tricks and traps to make Sen's Fortress look like a miniature obstacle course made for little newborn babies who are blind, you finally exit to the bottom of the Dragon Sanctum where you insert the Dragonstone into this little device that raises a bridge to another part of the Sanctum. Then you experience an excellent moment of level design with a lift that takes you right back to the start of the area. After crossing the newly raised bridge and re-entering the Sanctum, you'll do this small platforming section which, for once, isn't completely god-awful, so that's nice. After the platforming section I just described, you'll fight Alana, the Squalid Queen, who is an excellent boss in my opinion, very underrated if you ask me. Then, immediately after her boss fight, you'll fight Sin, the Slumbering Dragon, who takes the spot as being my second favorite boss in the entire game, and I absolutely love his boss fight. And not to mention, there's no run back to him whatsoever. Trust me, I'm very happy about that. So overall, Shulva is an absolutely excellent area that is a culmination of almost everything I love about Dark Souls 2, earning it the #2 spot on the list. Okay, so when I started the playthrough for this video's footage, I already knew what the worst area was going to be. I think everyone already knew. But I wasn't exactly sure about all the areas after that, except for this one. So believe me when I say that I think the #1 best area in all of Dark Souls 2 is none other than the Broom Tower. When you enter the Broom Tower, you'll climb a chain all the way up to the top of the tower and then gradually work your way downwards deeper into the Broom Tower. You'll alternate a lot between being outside of the tower and inside the tower. And man, the outside bits of the tower are super atmospheric. Seeing this crumbling, desolate tower in the middle of a volcanic setting completely covered in ash really is a special feeling when you first enter that I don't know how to properly explain. In fact, the opening bit can be so atmospheric for me that sometimes I just sit there and take in the ambience. It can be pretty nice to just do that sometimes because of how well the atmosphere is done. That is, unless the Forlorn decides to invade you. What an asshole! The outside sections aren't as beautiful as some other areas I've gone through before, but to be honest, they're still extremely pretty in my eyes, and I love the aesthetic. The indoor sections have a lot less detail put into them than the outside sections. They do look a little bland, but honestly I can forgive it this time given the whole industrial vibe the area is trying to establish. When you start out, the indoor sections of the Broom Tower will be almost entirely inoperable and the machinery won't really do anything. What you're meant to do is keep progressing in the area and do some exploration until you get the Scorching Iron Scepter. And after you receive that item, the tower will reignite and all the machinery will begin operating again. When it comes to the level design, I genuinely do think it is Dark Souls 2 at its absolute peak. Similarly to the Dragon Sanctum, it feels like an absolute labyrinth to traverse, but in the best possible way. The different scenarios and enemy encounters in the area are all unique and fun, and I can genuinely say that I've never once been bored when traversing the Broom Tower. Now, of course, the enemy placement isn't always perfect. If I had to call out anything in particular, would definitely be this room right here, but aside from those instances, I really enjoy playing through the Broom Tower and clearing out the enemies. There's also one small gimmick with the Broom Tower that I wanted to bring up because I think it was executed decently, and that is the gimmick with the Ashen Idols. You see, Nadalia, the Bride of Ash, is a Shard of Manus just like Alana, Nashandra, and Alsana, but she's encountered in a much different way. Instead of being a friendly NPC or a hostile boss, you'll encounter her in fragments via Ashen Idols, and you need to destroy the Ashen Idols using smelter wedges. The gimmick is a pretty minor part of the Broom Tower overall, but I think it was executed decently, and that it warranted a mention. After you've reignited all the machinery with the Scorching Iron Scepter, you'll begin your descent down into the very deepest parts of the Broom Tower. And deep within the absolute lowest depths of the tower, you'll fight the area's boss, the Fume Knight. This is easily my favorite boss in the game. It's both the best in terms of gameplay in my opinion, and it's also just, I mean, look at this dude. He's just so damn badass. And not to mention, you have basically no run back to him at all, which is a huge plus in my eyes, seeing as he is pretty challenging. I don't think he's the hardest in the game per se, but he is definitely a hard boss fight. Not to mention his soundtrack as well. It's extremely underrated in my eyes, and you're hearing it in the background right now. Everything I've just described about this area in this segment comes together to form what I believe is the absolute best that Dark Souls 2 has to offer when it comes to its levels, earning the Broom Tower the #1 spot on the list. So, in order to summarize my thoughts, Dark Souls 2 is a game that's often ostracized and disliked by the community, but to be honest, I think Dark Souls 2 is a masterpiece just like all the other Souls games, and I'd even argue that it's a better game than Dark Souls 1 was. And when it comes to the game's area lineup, it is a very mixed bag in terms of quantity, but a lot of the really bad areas are entirely optional. And combined with that, even though the game has its lows, it absolutely has its peaks. The areas like Ilium Lois, Shulva, Broom Tower, or Forest of Fallen Giants are all some of the best areas of the trilogy in my opinion. And so taking that into account, I believe Dark Souls 2's area roster stands just as tall as Dark Souls 1's. But anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. It was definitely fun getting to geek out again over some of my favorite areas and least favorite areas. Next time, I'm going to be wrapping up this, well, sort of trio of videos by making an area ranking of Dark Souls 3. Hopefully it'll be shorter than this one, because this is by far the longest video I've made yet, so yeah, it's gonna take a while to export. I'm kind of dreading that as of recording this, but until the next video, I'll see you all next time.